And now we're back to our menus. Following on from the last two videos, if you haven't watched them, I'd recommend watching them before you get into this one, because otherwise nothing will make sense. We are going to open up our pause menu under user interface and continue our work in there. The great thing about this pause menu is that it's laid out the foundations for our other menus. We're not going to create all the buttons we need in one menu. My personal preference when it comes to menus is to have a new blueprint for every single menu. It makes it easier to get around the event graph, and it makes it easier to understand what's going on. Because if we had thousands of buttons trying to put all of our menus into one blueprint, it would be a nightmare. So the first thing I want to tackle today is our controller functionality. We're going to need to do this for all menus, so we're going to start with this one. Get rid of your pre-construct and your construct. Move the event tick up. We're going to keep the event tick. So as I said before, our menus will be separate by nature, and what I'm going to do when I create another menu is I'm going to remove this menu. So only one menu will be up on a screen, which means this event tick will be absolutely fine, especially considering the game's paused when we use it. So I'd like to introduce you to another handy little piece of code that's been made into a node for us. Hold down F and click anywhere in the graph. This is called a for each loop. What it does is go through an entire list point by point. So if you have a list, or as Unreal would call it, an array of, say, characters, and you wanted to find out if those characters were dead, you could use that in. Plug in all your characters, the for each loop will go through them, and then we ask if it's dead. So drag off of here and click make array. This isn't the only way to make an array. You can have an array as a variable, which means that you can alter it as you go. Say you had an enemy appear on screen, you could add that to an array through code, but this is going to work for our menus. Now at the moment, the array doesn't have any elements to it. It's just an array waiting to be converted to something. The same way that our variables need a definition. What sort of variable is it? Is it a Boolean? Is it an integer, a float? This array also needs input as well. And the easiest way to do that is just like our select node, we just drag in a button, which in itself is an element. And then we plug that button in, and now the array has changed to a button object reference. So drag all of your buttons here. And if you want to save time, hold Control when you drag in, and you'll just get the getter. Once they're dragged in, plug them in. I like to plug them in the order they are in the menu for troubleshooting purposes in the future. If you're like me, you could straighten them up by selecting them all and pressing Q. And so that's the list. We're going to go through this list and check something that these buttons have in common. Now, as you could see there was a small glitch where the for each loop didn't actually register what we were inputting. So all I did was hold Alt, click on the array line here, the array connection, and just plug it back in so that it wasn't grayed out. So next up, what question do we want to ask, or what do we want to do with these? Because it's not just getting them and doing something they have in common. We could also set things as well. The question we want to ask each of these buttons is, has any user focus? Now, focus is what happens when we're hovering over a button with our mouse. But here's the problem. We're not using our mouse when we're using a controller. The mouse has nothing to do with it. So we need to check focus to do things with our buttons when the controller is focused on it. Also, don't forget to plug the tick into the executable here. Now let's throw a branch here, holding B and clicking anywhere in the graph. And so we're asking this question for each button. This will fire on one by one. We'll go button continue, has any user focus, and then whatever script we have here will fire, and then it will move on to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next. Like I said before, it's just going down whatever list we've provided and doing whatever we've told it to do. Now, if this button has user focus, what we want to do is drag off the array element, which is whatever button selected, and set background color. This node right here. And I'm going to double click on that line and get some reroutables just to clean that up so we can see where that's going. So if our button has focus, we want this color here. Give me a 1, a 1, a 1, and a 0.25. You can set this to whatever you want. This is what I'm going to use for the sake of this tutorial. Then if we copy that node over, it'll also copy over the settings for us. So plug this into false, and the difference is that we will zero out the button on the alpha, so it will be completely see-through when we have no focus. And don't forget to plug in the target to the other reroutable here like I did. Compile and save. So this will check which button's in focus and set the background color accordingly. Now the great thing about this script is it overwrites our hovered and normal modes, because our hovered and normal modes are a little bit of a pain to hop in here and set individually. There's stuff we're going to have to do just like that when the time comes. We're going to have to hop into these settings and fidget with these numbers. But here we've set up an automated system using a different setting. So this isn't the normal style. This is the background color down here that we're using. When we come up here to our style, we need to change that back over to a 1 on the alpha for both of them. And we'll set our background color to 0 so that it doesn't look wrong when we're actually looking in the menu in this form. And then if you had the hindsight, select all the buttons and do the same thing instead of doing them one by one. 0 on the alpha for background color, 1 on the hovered, and 1 on the normal style. Compile and save. Before we hit play, there's something else I want to do as well. Come up to play and hit the drop down. I want to open a new editor window every time I hit play. This just helps keep it clean for me. I prefer it this way because it's the correct aspect ratio for things I do. As you saw before, the menus were not as wide as the screen because our in-editor window is wider. I don't really want to change the default layout of Unreal. I like the way it is when I'm editing, but when I'm playing, I want to have the correct aspect ratio or the most popular aspect ratio, because obviously we are going to acknowledge people with different aspect ratios in the future. So now clicking on this window, it's essentially the same thing. If we press Tab and without touching the mouse, just press up and down on your arrow keys, you can see that those buttons are now in focus every time we're selecting them. And if we press enter, it actually gets us right back into the game. And if you happen to have a gamepad plugged into your PC because you are developing for consoles as well, which by the way, if you are developing for consoles, I would very much highly recommend having a gamepad at some point just to make sure it's all working. You don't want your early access guys to be telling you all of the problems you have with the gamepad that you could have solved just by plugging it in and testing yourself. So now with the mouse, I'm going to click on play, and then I'm going to click inside of the editor because you still have to do that even with the gamepad. And then with this gamepad, I've got my Xbox One controller plugged in. I'm going to press the pause button. Now the pause button's brought up our mouse. We'll change that a bit later. But if I was to press up and down on the D-pad, or if I was to use the analog sticks and press A, back on continue, we've got our gamepad working exactly the way we need it to work. So with that done, I want to make one of our alternate menus here just to show you again what I was describing when we started, how our menus are going to work from here on out. And it's a very easy menu. It's the quit menu. So closing our PC hero, we don't need our player controller. Pop down a user interface. Make sure that you have your pause menu compiled and saved. And for this menu, instead of getting another background blur, another border, setting our font and all of that, I just want to right click and duplicate this menu. Again, to my knowledge, I have not found a way to do the parent class tricks with user widgets. So for the meantime, stuff like the font trick I've partly shown you so far, and duplicating a ready-made menu is ways to get around that and save you from having to do that all again. So with the duplicated menu, type in quit, and we will double click on this menu and just change around some of the elements.